Onions hit hot fat. The kitchen fills. That deep, golden, almost narcotic sweetness. It stops you mid-step on a sidewalk, pulls you toward food trucks, makes you lean into a stranger's kitchen window. Surveys rank it among the most loved aromas on the planet. Billions of people, across every culture, every continent, agree. Frying onions smell extraordinary. But in 1885, the French novelist Émile Zola used that exact smell to describe something else entirely. Not comfort, not appetite. Poverty, filth, desperation. In his novel Germinal, the aroma of frying onions is the stench of the slums, same molecules, same chemical reaction. Completely opposite meaning. How does a smell change sides? 19th century Europe. No refrigeration, no canned goods, no welfare state. If you were poor, and most people were, you ate what grew cheap, stored long, and cooked fast. That meant onions. They thrived in any soil. They survived months in a cellar. A kilogram cost less than a single egg. You could eat them raw, boil them into broth with stale bread, or fry them in whatever scrap of animal fat you had left. Across France, England, Germany, the onion was not a flavoring. It was a meal, often the only meal. This was not new. Onion had been poor people's food for millennia. The builders of the Egyptian pyramids were paid in onions and bread. Literally, their wages were alliums. Roman soldiers carried them on campaign as field rations. Medieval European peasants survived winters on stored onions when every other vegetable had rotted away. In 14th century England, onions and bread were sometimes the only food mentioned in records of workhouse meals. By the 19th century, the onion had thousands of years of history as the food you ate when you could not afford anything better. It was nutritious, calorie-dense for its price, and, crucially, it tasted like something. In a world where poverty meant bland monotony, a fried onion was flavor itself. It was the one luxury the poor could afford. Zola knew this. He had spent months living among coal miners in northern France, researching Germinal. He descended into the pits. He ate with the families. He saw how they lived. The novel follows the Maheu family. 10 people crammed into a brick row house in a settlement called Montsou. They eat onions fried in lard, potatoes if they are lucky, meat almost never. The smell saturates their walls, their clothes, their skin. It mixes with coal dust, damp laundry, unwashed bodies. Zola does not describe this smell as pleasant. He weaponizes it. Every time the reader encounters that frying onion odor, it signals the same thing. These people are trapped. In his hands, frying onions become shorthand for an entire class that the comfortable bourgeoisie would rather pretend does not exist. And his readers understood the code instantly. They could smell it in their imagination and recoil. Here is why. In late 19th century France, food was class-made visible. The bourgeoisie ate butter, cream, elaborate sauces, 6-course dinners. Classical French cuisine, escoffier, carême, was engineered to demonstrate wealth. Every dish was a performance of refinement. Sauces took hours. Stock simmered for days. Ingredients were expensive, imported, rare. A bourgeois kitchen smelled of roasting veal, of wine reductions, of fresh herbs. It smelled of money. Onions existed in these kitchens, yes, but buried. Sweated quietly into a mirepoix, dissolved into stock, hidden beneath layers of reduction. The onion was a secret ingredient. You were never supposed to smell it on its own. A kitchen that reeked of frying onions was a kitchen that had failed at the most basic task of respectable cooking: concealment. The whole point of bourgeois food was to disguise effort, to make abundance look effortless. Smelling the onion meant seeing the seams. That would be vulgar. The poor had no such luxury. When onions were not a background note but the entire meal, fried hard in lard because nothing else was available, the smell announced itself. It billowed through hallways. It seeped through walls. And to anyone with a full pantry, it carried one unmistakable message: this household cannot afford real food. Think of it this way. Imagine walking through a neighborhood today and smelling instant ramen from every single apartment. The noodles are fine. Millions eat them by choice. But when that smell is the only smell, inescapable, relentless, the olfactory wallpaper of an entire community, it tells a different story. That is what fried onions meant in Zola's France. And this was not just French snobbery. The pattern repeated across Europe. In Victorian London, Henry Mayhew documented penny onion vendors in his survey London Labour and the London Poor. Street sellers frying onions for workers who could not afford anything else. The smell clung to the East End's narrow courts and middle-class cookbooks warned against using too many onions, lest the odor give visitors the wrong impression. In Germany, Zwiebelgeruch, onion smell, was shorthand for tenement living well into the 20th century. From Paris to Berlin to London, the equation was simple. Frying onions equaled poverty. The richer you were, the less your kitchen should smell like anything at all. But something shifted. And the shift came from the top. By the 1920s and 1930s, classical French cuisine was collapsing under its own weight. The elaborate aristocratic tradition that had buried the onion was growing stale, repetitive, exhausting. A new generation of chefs and food writers began turning to something they had long ignored: regional cooking, the food of the provinces, peasant food. Lyonnaise cuisine, built almost entirely around onions and pork. Provençal cooking, drenched in garlic and olive oil. Breton crêpe, Alsatian choucroute, dishes that had been dismissed for generations suddenly appeared on Parisian menus. Onion soup, tarte flambée, pissaladière. The legendary soup à l'oignon gratiné, born in the pre-dawn markets of Les Halles, where night workers ate it for warmth and sustenance, became fashionable precisely because of its humble origins. The bourgeoisie, bored with their own pretensions, discovered what the poor had always known. Onions, cooked slow and low until they collapsed into amber sweetness, were magnificent. The Second World War accelerated the change. Rationing shattered food hierarchies overnight. A duchess and a dock worker queued for the same ration of cooking fat. In Britain, the Ministry of Food promoted onion-based recipes as patriotic duty. Nutritious, affordable, available. The vegetable that once signaled deprivation was rebranded as a wartime virtue. Onions became so scarce during the war that British families actually celebrated receiving one as a gift. Imagine that, an onion, wrapped up like a present. The psychology flipped. Scarcity made the humble onion precious. After the war, Europe rebuilt. A new middle class emerged. The rigid class lines of the 19th century blurred. Onions were still cheap, but cheap was no longer automatically shameful. Then the 1960s and 1970s delivered the final blow. The counterculture attacked food snobbery head-on. Farm-to-table cooking, vegetarianism, whole grains instead of white flour, root vegetables instead of imported delicacies, a hunger for authenticity over artifice. Simple was no longer inferior. Simple was honest. Elizabeth David championed French provincial food in England. The rustic, onion-heavy cuisine of Lyon and Provence. Julia Child brought it to American kitchens, teaching millions that a perfectly caramelized onion was worth more than a dozen complicated sauces. The very cuisine that Zola's bourgeois readers had wrinkled their noses at was suddenly aspirational. Sweating onions in butter was no longer a sign of poverty. It was a sign of taste. It was a declaration. And then science stepped in to explain why. When onions hit hot fat, a cascade of reactions fires. Cell walls rupture, sugars pour out and caramelize against the pan's surface. Amino acids undergo the Maillard reaction, the same chemistry that browns bread crust and sears steak, generating hundreds of flavor compounds that did not exist in a raw onion. Harsh sulfur molecules mellow into savory depth. The raw onion attacks your eyes. The cooked onion seduces your brain. The volatile compounds that drift into the air trigger something primal, a deep, almost hardwired pleasure response that crosses every cultural boundary. Researchers at the Monell Chemical Senses Center found that the aroma of frying alliums ranks among the most universally appealing food smells, regardless of diet or geography. It does not matter whether you grew up eating onions every day or have never cooked one in your life. The smell registers as good. Instinctively, immediately, what Zola used as evidence of misery, science revealed as a masterpiece of biochemistry. But here is the twist that makes this more than a story about food rehabilitation. The smell never changed, not one molecule. The Maillard reaction in a miner's pan in 1885 produced the exact same compounds as a Michelin-starred chef's pan in 2025. The technique was the same. The chemistry was the same. The pleasure it triggered in the human brain was the same. The only thing that changed was who was holding the pan, and whether society had decided that person deserved dignity. Zola's miners were not cooking badly. They were cooking brilliantly. Taking the cheapest ingredient available and transforming it through heat and fat into something deeply satisfying. That is not poverty cooking. That is craft. The bourgeoisie just could not see it, because seeing it would mean admitting that the poor had taste, skill, and something worth savoring. That is how food meanings actually work. They are never about the food. They are about power, about class, about who gets to decide what counts as refined and what counts as base. The onion did not climb the social ladder. Society rearranged the ladder around it. And the fact that we can now breathe in that golden, sweet, sharp perfume and feel nothing but warmth and appetite, that is not a shift in taste. It is a monument to slow erosion of the class systems that once decided even which smells were acceptable. Zola would appreciate the irony. The writer who built his career exposing how the powerful stripped dignity from the poor, how they turned even the act of eating into evidence of inferiority, would find it fitting that the smell he weaponized as proof of squalor is now universally beloved. The onions won, the snobbery lost. Next time you hear that sizzle, remember what you are smelling. Something that fed Roman legions and Egyptian pyramid builders. Something that sustained generations of miners and factory workers who had nothing else. Something that once divided a continent by class. And something that turned out to be exactly what everyone always secretly knew it was. Just a really, really good smell.